Okay, this is a lecture for Chapter 3, and in this lecture we're going to hit the summary points concerning the history of drug policy in the United States. I have here on the PowerPoint slides the title of policy, but it's actually really the history of the policies in the United States, and we're going to have to keep it, definitely a summary, because whenever you're covering the history of the United States, that's a pretty big, pretty tall order to do that. So we're just going to try to rapidly cover the most important points, and hopefully we can do that without extending these lectures out too long. So let's get started. First highlighted point here: the use of psychoactive drugs has been part of human life in almost every culture and every age of recorded history. Drugs have been used in the context of religious rituals, healthcare, celebration, and recreation. So that's a big general point that gets us kicked off here. That drugs is, if you didn't know better, you might think it's kind of a recent phenomenon, but it's not. It's been, people throughout time have found, perhaps accidentally, that some substances coming from plants produce, different kinds of effects on people, and people have sort of got into the practice of using these substances for various activities. A lot of times sort of tied up in sort of religious activities, more so perhaps than nowadays, but also recreational use or celebratory use, or sort of these drugs thought to have medicinal properties as well. So there's some similarities. One big difference that I need to stress, and it'll come up more than once this semester, is that one big difference between now and the past is that these products tend to be used in their natural diluted form in the past. And nowadays, due to technology and sort of the lab production of drugs, that these drugs have tended to get much more powerful than their natural or diluted forms, much more concentrated, and therefore also more dangerous. And I've got this point listed right here about drugs being much more concentrated nowadays than in the past. Over the course of our nation's history, attitudes towards certain drugs and certain forms of drug-taking behavior have fluctuated between enthusiastic acceptance and passionate rejection. And also just sort of, throw in there as well ignorance, indifference, just maybe the drugs not being on people's radars. That's been a big part of the story too. It's not always been extremes of really, highly valuing the drug on the one end and hating, aggressively rejecting drugs on the other end. There's been different points in between those extremes as well. In the United States, attitudes of drugs have swung back and forth, often seeing a new drug as benign or even helpful, maybe medicinal, maybe, having positive effects somehow, but then turning against the drug when harms were perceived. So that's been a pretty consistent pattern. I don't think the textbook really stresses that enough for my taste, that you see swinging back and forth in attitudes, and usually it has to do with the drug being new, and when it's new, people are kind of more positive about it or neutral. But then they see the fallout, they see the negative consequences, the harms, and sometimes those harms can be not only perceived but exaggerated sometimes. And then so people will turn against the drugs, perhaps pushing for legislation, for governmental controls, out of the perceived harms that the drugs impose on society. Morphine, let's start in the history of the United States. Let's pick it up around Civil War, 1860s. Scientists were able to take opium, which is closer to the natural form, and to convert that into morphine, which was then used medically as a treatment for pain, for injuries that soldiers suffered during not World War II, but the Civil War. So it was prescribed. It was given widely among injured soldiers, and it turns out that we know now that the dependence is very high. The addictive quality of morphine is very strong, and dependence grew among these Civil War veterans who were recovering from injuries. Some of them got addicted to the drug, and the addiction was quite common because there were a lot of soldiers injured, a lot of soldiers who had been given morphine, and then became dependent on it. A little bit later, after the Civil War, middle-class women were often given morphine injections to treat various illnesses by physicians, so it was given medically, it was not given illegally. But you saw, as again, this shows this pattern. In the beginning, people think it's going to be very positive. This is a very powerful painkiller. It helps alleviate people's suffering. So people are positive about it. And then they begin to see that a lot of people get addicted to it. A lot of these women who were receiving this would become addicted in a legal, very legal context from doctors, prescribed morphine. And that almost half the cases of drug dependence were these sort of women, very often wealthy or middle-class women, had enough money to pay for a doctor and to pay for the treatments, to pay for these drugs. So that was a common way that people were becoming addicted in the late 1800s. Now, so also along with this story of opiates and morphine was other drugs like cocaine. For example, this is the famous example of Coca-Cola. The original formula for Coca-Cola contained coca from coca leaves until 1903, as did Dr. Agnew's catarrh powder, a popular medicine given for chest colds around 1900. So these were drugs that were discovered, and they were thought to have positive properties of healing, of making people feel better. And in the early period of time, they didn't see the harms; they just saw the positives. And so you saw, these very strong drugs put into a lot of different products, not just those that you think of as strictly being, drug treatment products, but things that were taken more widely and more popularly, as in the case of Coca-Cola. In the mid-1800s, Parke Davis and Company was selling cocaine and its botanical source, coca, in more than a dozen forms, including coca leaf cigarettes, cigars, cocaine inhalants, and coca cordial. So we're talking about drinks. They had a lot of various drinks, not just like Coca-Cola, but various mixtures, drinks, where they would put drugs in there, and also an injectable cocaine solution. So it was put in many different forms and was sold, advertised as being these different types of remedies, of medicines that would supposedly improve, if not cure, various illnesses. So this was popular and common in the late 1800s and around 1900. You had someone as famous as Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, who used cocaine himself. So you had doctors who might think that this was a positive sort of treatment. He called cocaine a magical drug. He used it himself, but then he later reversed his opinion when he had a friend and colleague who became seriously addicted to cocaine. So again, these individuals began to see the negatives and then sort of reverse their attitudes about a lot of these drugs as they got more experience with them. During the 19th century, the America's public attitude towards drug use was typically one that you call laissez-faire, the French word, which means something along the line of, let people do what they're going to do. And there was little regulation, little control of drugs, because if you study the history of the United States in its early days, and then in the 1800s, for example, there tended to be, especially at the federal level, coming out of Washington, D.C., minimal government. You had the country growing rapidly. You had pioneers moving west and continuously further west and out in sort of frontier lands where law was minimal. And so you had a lot of people doing what they're going to do without the government controlling what they're going to do. And that was true in a lot of ways for, say the first century plus of the United States. So there was a lot of just lack of laws and policy in many areas, not just drugs. The U.S. was the only major Western nation that allowed the unlimited distribution, sale, and promotion of psychoactive drugs during this period. So you had, say, for example, European countries that were older and much more well established, didn't have frontiers, didn't have pioneers and frontiers like we saw in America. And those more established countries that had larger bureaucracies, larger governments, were more controlling. They had more laws and policies against drugs compared to this new country, the United States, which was not so developed and, did not such have a large bureaucratic national government. Two major factors explain why there were no major drug control policies during this period. Number one, an unregulated medical profession, and number two, an emphasis on states' rights over federal control. And that's these two points are taken from the textbook. And those are in addition to the point that I just made, which is in a new country with a frontier and a lot of pioneers spreading continuously west, your law was minimal. So that frontier factor is one of the factors, but these other two are factors as well, which is you had a medical profession which was not nearly as regulated and controlled as it is now. You had more sort of kind of self-made doctors, or there was just more people who were practicing medicine who didn't necessarily have all this extensive licensing and training that they would have now. And so it just was, again, it's another way that there was a lack of control. And so the undeveloped, unbureaucratized medical profession would be part of that story. And number two, an emphasis on states' rights. So if you look at study the history of the country, in its original conception, the founders really wanted the states to have a lot of control over the people residing in a state, and the federal government to remain very restrained and with only limited duties, limited responsibilities, and to not have the federal government control everything that was going on in individual states. So that's how the country started out, was much more of an emphasis on a collection of states that were united together, hence United States of America, but had a lot of independence and individual sovereignty. And so a big story in the history of the United States is a gradual movement of power and control and authority away from the individual states more and more to Washington, D.C., to the national government. So that's if you want to know the history of the United States in one sentence, that's a pretty good one sentence summary, which is greater and greater control out of Washington. And that's true of the history of drugs, as we shall see. Around 1900, hundreds of patent medicines were sold that included such ingredients as alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, marijuana, etc. So now what do we mean by patent medicines? These are medicines that were made by unregulated businesses who kept ingredients secret and advertised the drugs in newspapers, magazines, and traveling medicine shows. Let me focus on this traveling medicine show because this really gives a flavor for early America, for America around the turn of the century. That you had these things that were, you had people, traveling salesmen, who would move from town to town. Of course, the country was very rural, small town. A lot of people living out in the countryside, farmers. So you'd have these travel salesmen who would take around their products to the people and sell them to the people. And one of the commonly sold products was various patent medicines. And they were just, what we mean by patent medicines is some company would put together some mixture, very often a beverage. That's where we get things like Coca-Cola and a lot of different beverages coming out of that era, where they would have some drugs mixed into this formula. And then they'd sell you a bottle of this and say, hey, it's, it'll fix this, it'll cure that. it's a miracle drug or whatever, making all these claims about what it could do. And very often these patent medicines had ingredients in them which are now illegal, which are now criminal to be selling, on the street or wherever in a store or by a traveling salesman. So again, it shows the unregulated nature of the situation. Plus, these companies would make these formulas, but they didn't want other people copying the formulas and selling the exact same thing. And so they would keep the ingredients secret, not let people know everything that was in these patent medicines. And none of it was regulated, not approved by the government. You didn't have to go through a process to get a patent to control, the sale, the manufacture and sale of these drugs. It just wasn't regulated like that at the time. Well, so as the popularity of these patent medicines grew, cases of accidental poisoning from ingredients in these medicines became widespread, and media communicated harms to the people. So this is again a good example of the cycle of drugs. People are excited about them at first. They think they focus on the positives, on how it makes you feel better or it does certain things for you. Everybody gets excited and it's accepted and it's legal and fine. But then you see the cost. Then later on you see the benefits. You see addiction. You see overdoses. You see accidental poisonings. People die. And then people begin to panic, and then it spreads in the media. And then everybody maybe kind of swings to the other extreme where now they're poison. The drugs are seen, before they were seen as like miracle cures. Now they're seen as poison, and they regulate them. So you had President Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 push the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. So now we're starting to see the national government, Washington, D.C., push for laws that apply to the whole country, that apply to all the states. That with this drug act, it was established the requirement that all packaged foods, not just drugs, foods of all types and drugs, list the ingredients on the label. So they had to let the public know this is exactly what is in this food, what is in this patent medicine, in this drink you're taking that's supposed to make you better. They had to tell honestly what was in it. And if they didn't tell you what was in it, then they could be prosecuted. They could be legally in trouble for lying to the public. So that was the first step, is sort of like truth in advertising. Let the people know what's in it. Now that's not super strong regulation. You're not saying you can't use these patent medicines, or that you can't sell them. You just have to tell people what's in them. So that was the first national kind of step, is let's get the truth out there about what's in these patent medicines. No more secrets, no more hiding stuff. Okay, let's stop there. We'll continue on in part 2.